Welcome friends, welcome back to the kitchen. A couple of weeks ago I made a brown butter banana chocolate chip cookie, and Julie and I tasted them and the brown butter was lost. And afterwards, deep from the back part of my brain came this memory of what I could have done to really ramp up that brown butter flavor, still using the same amount of butter so I wouldn't have to change the recipe too much. So today I'm going to make a cake, a chocolate cake, and we're going to put a brown butter frosting on it. I'm going to start out with a cake that I've made in the past. So this cake recipe starts out by dumping most of the ingredients into this pot. So I start out with sugar, water, some instant coffee, some butter, and the chocolate. And I've got this over medium heat. We just want to melt all of this together. Melt the chocolate, melt the butter, melt the sugar into one nice homogeneous mass. Now, I've made this cake in the past. On this channel, made this cake in the past. And based on, my cookbook collection, Canadian cookbooks, 50s, 60s, 70s, they call this a dump cake because pretty much you dump everything into this pot. You melt it all together. You just dump it together. There's no mixer. There's nothing fancy about it. Boy, did I get mail. So I've got some flour here, and I've got baking powder and baking soda and salt, and I'm just going to mix that together. Apparently, dump cake in the United States just means taking a box of cake mix, dumping it into the pan that you're going to cook it in, and then just mixing in some water or milk or whatever it is you mix into a boxed cake. And that's how English gets used differently when you cross an international border, even one as interconnected as Canada and the United States. So I'm still going to call this a dump cake because, I'm going to stick to my guns. I'm in Canada. I'm making a dump cake. Okay, this has melted together nicely, so I'm going to take it off the heat. And I'm just going to sit it over here and let this cool down to, body temperature, room temperature, whatever. You just don't want to do the next steps with this as hot as it is right now. And I didn't bring this anywhere close to a boil even. So this is just slightly higher than body temperature, just enough to melt the chocolate and the butter. Okay, I'm going to switch to whisk at this point, and we are good. So that's cooled down just enough. I'll set that aside. Next ingredient is some buttermilk. So we can just pour that in. And some vanilla extract. The vanilla extract isn't strictly necessary. It does build the background flavors. It does sort of prop up the chocolate flavor, make the chocolate flavor a little more chocolatey. Not strictly necessary. I'm going to add some chocolate liqueur. That again lifts the chocolate flavor. Not strictly necessary. But the two things, this is 40% alcohol by volume and this one is 17. So less alcohol from the alcohol than from the vanilla. But the alcohol itself in the cake releases a bunch of other flavors, makes the whole thing more flavorful. So you can leave them out if you don't want to use them, but I highly suggest that you put them in. So I'm just going to whisk that in, and now I'm going to whisk in these 2 eggs. First egg. Second egg, and give that a whisk, break up the yolks, and then just mix in the flour a little bit at a time. Don't overload the pot. Okay, now I have a prepared pan, 9 by 13. I've greased it and put a parchment sling, and we'll just get that cake batter in there. Switch back to the spatula, and we'll get it all in. Now, the oven's preheated to 375 degrees. So I'm going to get this in the oven, and we'll bake it off. And then you've really got to let it cool down for probably an hour, hour and a half before you get to the point where you're putting on the icing. The cake really needs to cool. Okay, so we're going to brown the butter now, which was the whole point of today's video, was me to try something from the back of my mind that I remember from long, long ago, browning butter. How to get it more brown, how to get more brown flavor into the brown butter. So we talked about this last time. Butter, milk. Let's start with milk. Milk is mostly water with some fat and some milk solids, which are mostly proteins. In the butter making process, you churn it all up. The proteins and the fat clump together and the water separates, and you get rid of the water. And the more water you get rid of, the better the butter is, theoretically. It has a higher fat content because it has a lower water content, but there's still always some water in the butter. And the first part of the browning process is driving that water off so that you can get the heat up to a point where you can brown those proteins. When the water's present, you can't brown the proteins. So at the beginning of this browning process, it'll bubble and it'll make a lot of noise. Then it gets quiet and then it browns really quickly. But what's browning isn't the fat, it is the proteins, the milk solids. So adding extra fat doesn't do anything. Adding extra milk protein does something. So I'm going to add, as soon as the butter melts, I'm going to add some dry milk powder, which is no fat, no liquid, obviously, because it's dry. It is just the milk solids. It is just the proteins. And so that protein mixed in with the extra protein mixed in with the fat will allow more browning, will give us a bigger, deeper, richer brown flavor. I hope. Okay, the butter is mostly melted and it's starting to spit and sputter. That's it driving off the water. The water is evaporating. In with the extra milk protein, and we'll stir that in. Now, I'm someone who has always relied very heavily on the sound of the butter changing to know when my brown butter was almost done. Adding in that milk solid, the dry milk powder, the sound isn't quite as pronounced. I can see, though, that it's bubbling heavily as the water is driven off. I can also see that extra milk protein that I dumped in is already browning. So this is a completely different brown butter browning experience than I usually have. And I wish I had paid more attention years ago when the chef taught me this. And I wish I'd done it more often so that it would be easier for me to tell you what's going on here. So I'm on medium heat. I'm stirring it constantly, and the color is changing into a nice deep brown. And the trick now is pulling it off at the right time so that you don't burn it. Okay, I'm saying that's brown enough for me. Look at that color. Taking it off the heat. Now, as soon as I take it off the heat, the pot is still cooking this. It's still making it browner and browner. I'm going to pour in some cream. That'll slow down the cooking a little bit, but it's also going to help with the next operation. It is part of the frosting recipe. So I'm going to leave this here on the counter for probably about a half an hour. Let it cool down to at least room temperature. After it's cooled down a bit, if you want to stick it in the fridge and let it cool down even farther, almost to a solid, that would be fine as well, because we're just going to be whipping this into the frosting. So, just going to leave it. I'm going to walk away. I'll come back in a little bit. Now, from this point forward, it's a pretty standard butter and icing sugar type combination. So I'm going to put the butter into the stand mixer, and we're going to fluff this up really well. This is the point where I'm supposed to tell you to only use unsalted butter because we're going to put salt in and you want to control the salt content. Not terribly important in 2022. That's one of those holdover rules that people tell you that really is from the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, 1500s. The farther I go back into the cookbooks, the more that is very important. And that comes down to the way that butter was manufactured. Today, butter is highly regulated, and the amount of salt in salted butter is highly regulated. We know exactly how much salt is in a pound of butter, to within 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt in a pound of butter. So I pretty much just use salted butter and cut back a little bit on the salt that I add. I only keep one kind of butter in my fridge. Okay, so I've whipped that butter on high for about 5 minutes, and now I'm going to add probably 2/3 of the icing sugar. And this is a good point to put in some vanilla. Now I'm going to mix in the brown butter mixture, and I'm not going to lie, it smells wonderful, but it doesn't look very good. So let's see, how do I get this in here without... How do I get this in here? Okay, we'll just scrape that in. Looks a little bit like baby sick. Now, from this point forward, I just tip in a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more of the icing sugar until I reach a consistency that I like. I look at this type of frosting not as an exact, here's how much you have to put in, but more of a art. Here's how much I'd like to put in. And don't forget to stop every once in a while and scrape down the sides of the bowl. Very important.
Woo! Hey friends, hey Glen. Second chance at frosting?
Second chance at
All
frosting.
right, I'm totally getting a spoon
Okay.
for frosting first.
So the first go around at the frosting, I had just pulled, you know, the skim milk powder out of the...
Much better.
Yeah.
Much better.
We'll cut to that of the previous tasting. Can you taste that?
Okay.
Tell me what you think.
I'm glad you have a spoon. Oh, it's... It has a chalky flavor to it.
I think the milk powder's gone bad.
Good.
Okay.
I'm sure there's an expiry date on it, is there?
There is.
And how long ago is it? Long?
A little while.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to remake this. Make sure that your ingredients are always up. But this is...
A little chalky.
I mean, don't you put this in your bomb shelter and keep it for 40 years?
No, there's a rotation schedule
Okay.
with your food that you put in your shelter.
Okay, so I'm going to get more. I'm going to get fresh milk powder, and I'm going to make this again. So
Yeah, that's got to go. That's not really...
we're going to taste the cake tomorrow. Okay, now we're back.
That's a lot of frosting, and I feel like I see like you've got lots of frosting on there. Was it supposed to be another cake?
Well, I decided just to do it like this as one sheet cake sort of thing. But the amount of frosting is for a layer cake. So
Okay.
you could bake this in 2 round pans or 2 square pans. Do it as a layer cake with the frosting in between and the whole.
That's pretty good. I like that.
Yeah.
It's a very uncomplicated cake. It's cake. It's great.
But there's something about that chocolate cake with the brown butter frosting that is amazing, isn't it?
I keep wanting to eat more frosting though.
I know.
Because you know, we usually don't put frosting on it, but it's pretty good here.
Okay, so this is a super simple cake. Really easy to make. You saw me just dump everything into that pot and stir it around. Loads of flavor in that. And give the skim milk a try in your brown butter. It really does up that brown butter flavor. Just make sure your skim milk is, your dry milk is fresh. Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.
And some extra.